Hello everyone and welcome to the first session of TCC's protest webinar series of 2021. This is a continuation of the History of Protest series that began last semester, and it's a combined effort of the social science faculty from around the district. Thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon as we discuss protests and Black history. My name is Misty Wilson-Mertens, and I serve as the Chair of Social Sciences for the Connect campus. I want to thank Dr. Chloe Northrop from the Northeast campus for all of her work on this series. She is one of the co-creators of this, and she's running background for us today. So students, as you've already seen in the chat, if you have any questions as we go, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll try to get them answered as we go or at the end. We also want you to know that at the end of the whole session, there will be an attendance link. So please fill that out if you are getting credit from one of your professors for attending. So I also want to thank our three speakers that are joining us today. We're really happy to have them and for them to enlighten us. So we're going to hear from Stacy Muse, Dr. Meredith May, and Joan Johnson. Our first presentation is going to be from Stacy Muse. She will be speaking today about the Freedom Riders. Stacy Muse is currently serving as an adjunct instructor of government with Tarrant County College. She has taught both federal and Texas government for us. She's a graduate of North Carolina Central University, where she earned her master's in public administration. She's also a University of Oklahoma graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Human Relations and a minor in African and African American Studies. Thank you, Professor Muse, for joining us.
Thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And as you stated, Misty, my name is Stacy Muse, and I will be presenting on the journey to freedom, how Freedom Riders showcase the effectiveness of protesting. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in it. I'm going to get control of the slides. Okay, awesome. Let's see. Okay, so in order for us to understand exactly the effectiveness of the Freedom Riders protest, we want to lay the framework for understanding what it is the Freedom Riders actually did. And so the Freedom Riders were groups of African American civil rights activists and white allies who were also civil rights activists that participated in freedom rides, which were bus trips through the American South in 1961 to protest segregated bus terminals. While protesting at these terminals, Freedom Riders tried to use whites-only restrooms and lunch counters at bus stations in Alabama, South Carolina, and other southern states. The groups were confronted by arresting police officers, as well as horrific violence from white protesters along their routes. But the horrific violence that the Freedom Riders endured drew the international attention needed for the civil rights movement. The Freedom Rides represented a major evolution in the tactics and strategy of the civil rights movement. Freedom Riders were movement leaders of the Congress of Racial Equality, which we refer to as CORE, the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, which we refer to as SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which we refer to as SNCC. These civil rights pioneers saw that nonviolent direct action could deliver results, even when met with determined and violent opposition from white supremacists inside and outside of local government. So, exactly who were these Freedom Riders? The Freedom Rides initially began with what is referred to as the original 13, which included the late and great Representative John Lewis. However, as the movement continued to gain national attention, more civil rights activists continued to join the efforts to abolish segregation at bus terminals, which would serve as a milestone towards abolishing segregation in its totality in the South. Now, for the sake of time, I will not read all of the names listed, but some of the Freedom Riders were Reverend Abernathy, Stokely Carmichael, Glenda Davis, Genevieve Houghton, James Lawson, John Lewis. Moving a bit slow. James Peck, Joseph Perkins, and also the late great C.T. Vivian. So, what made the Freedom Rides effective? For this, we're going to review three key components that assisted in making the Freedom Rides as effective as they were. Now, those three components are the momentum from early milestones of the civil rights movement, civil rights activists as key participants, and how the movement engaged the media. Yes, the media. So although the media today isn't what it was back then, the media played a huge role in getting those issues put on the national table. So, prior to the Freedom Rides, the Civil Rights Movement began to gain national attention in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which was a consolidation of 5 cases into one that, due to the decision of the Supreme Court, ended racial segregation in public schools. Now, there were many murderous events that continued during this time period towards the fight of equality in this country, but it brings us to the December 1st, 1955 date, which was when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. It was her defiant stance that prompted the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. In 1960, Bruce Boyton, a Black law student, bought a Trailways bus ticket to ride from Washington, D.C. to Montgomery, Alabama. During a 40-minute stopover in Richmond, Virginia, Boyton entered a restaurant at the terminal where he sat on a seat in the white-only side of a segregated restaurant. He was arrested and convicted of violating a state law intended for trespass. The Supreme Court decided that segregation of interstate transportation facilities, including bus terminals, was unconstitutional. That alone is what prompted the 1961 Freedom Rides to test this decision that was made by the Supreme Court. So, earlier we mentioned the Montgomery bus boycott. Its significance to the Freedom Rides lies in its leadership. Reverend Ralph Abernathy was a key figure in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and beyond. As a young pastor of First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, he and Dr. King were among the leaders of the 55-56 Montgomery bus boycott, organized in response to the arrest of Rosa Parks. In '61, Abernathy's First Baptist Church was the site of the May 21st siege, where an angry mob of white segregationists surrounded 1,500 people inside of that sanctuary. At one point, the situation seemed so dire that Abernathy and King considered giving themselves to the mob to save the men, women, and children in that sanctuary. When reporters asked Abernathy to respond to Robert Kennedy's complaint that the Freedom Riders were embarrassing the United States in front of the world, Abernathy responded, "Well, doesn't the Attorney General know we've been embarrassed all of our lives?" On May 25th, Abernathy was arrested on breach of peace charges after escorting William Sloane Coffin's Connecticut Freedom Ride to the Montgomery Greyhouse bus terminal. Neither the first nor the last instance of civil disobedience in a lifetime of activism. After Dr. King's assassination on April 4th of '68, Abernathy took up the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Poor People's Campaign, and led the '68 March on Washington. It was in 1990 that Abernathy passed. Now, by the time that the then 19-year-old John Lewis joined the 1961 Core Freedom Ride, he already had 5 arrests under his belt as a veteran of the Nashville student movement. The son of hardscrabble tenant farmers from Pike County, Alabama, he attended American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee, where he was deeply influenced by Reverend Kelly Miller Smith and Reverend James Lawson. On May 10th, several days before the riders crossed into Alabama, Lewis had left the Core Ride to interview for a fellowship. By chance, he was in Nashville on May 14th when the news broke of the violent bus burning in Anniston, Alabama, and the riot at the Birmingham Trailways bus station. Lewis helped to convince his friends and mentors from the Nashville student movement to get involved. He rode to Birmingham with the Nashville cohort, endured the angry mob in Montgomery, and was arrested in Jackson and served jail time in Mississippi's Parchman State Prison Farm. Lewis would become the best known among the youthful freedom riders, serving as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, speaking at the '63 March on Washington, and playing a pivotal role in the '65 Selma Montgomery March. In '86, Lewis was elected to represent Georgia in the U.S. House of Representatives. Lastly, James Peck, radical journalist and pacifist, was the only individual to participate in both the Fellowship of Reconciliation's 47 Journey of Reconciliation, which provided CORE its structure. Peck became increasingly involved in issues of racial injustice, joining the Congress of Racial Equality as a volunteer. On May 14th, Peck assumed de facto leadership of the 1961 CORE Freedom Ride after James Farmer returned to Washington for his father's funeral. Peck sustained heavy injuries to the face and head during the Ku Klux Klan riot at the Birmingham Trailways bus station. It took more than an hour for Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to find an ambulance willing to take Peck to the all-white Caraway Methodist Hospital, where even then staff refused to treat him. Peck was finally able to see a doctor at Jefferson Hillman Hospital, where he received 53 stitches. Undeterred by his injuries, he urged the riders to continue. A quote from Genevieve Hughes stated, "If he could be beaten as he was and still go on, we certainly felt we could go on as well." In '76, Peck, along with Walter Bergman, filed a lawsuit against the FBI seeking $100,000 in damages for the lasting injuries he sustained as a result of the riot, which paid the FBI informant Gary Thomas Rowell Jr. was also a participant. In '83, he was awarded a partial settlement of $25,000. Peck passed away in '93. So, although the media today isn't what the media was, the Freedom Rides were successful in large part because they were able to engage the media and gain a sympathetic national audience. A handful of reporters and photographers from the Black press and one freelance writer affiliated with the Congress of Racial Equality accompanied the riders on the buses during CORE's original May 4th Freedom Ride. Other than these journalists, initial news coverage of the rides was mixed or strongly negative, kind of what we see in regards to how the news covers the Black Lives Matter movement. Early news accounts criticized extremists on both sides, equating civil rights activists with their segregationist opposition. Other editorials characterized the Freedom Riders as outside agitators, meddling in communities to which they do not belong, although many of the African American riders had been raised in the South. The images and eyewitness accounts of May 14th, 1961 changed the country's consciousness altogether. Footage of a burning bus in Anniston, Alabama shocked the nation, as did photographs of the beatings inflicted during the riot at the Birmingham Trailways bus station. And that one photo of a bandaged face from Freedom Rider James Peck lying in a hospital bed. All of these pictures combined were unlike anything that Americans had seen previously. Images brought home the brutality of the white segregationist regime in a way that words alone could not convey. Klan members attacked Birmingham Post-Herald photographer Tommy Langston, along with other members of the media, and attempted to destroy their film, but miraculously, the film of roll inside Langston's smashed camera survived intact. News reporters and photographers accompanied Freedom Riders through most of the ride's key events, including the riot on May 21st of 1961. On this evening, more than 1,000 Black residents and civil rights leaders, including Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth, attended a service at Montgomery's First Baptist Church. The service, organized by Freedom Rider Reverend Abernathy, as we stated earlier, was planned to support the Freedom Riders. As the service took place, a white mob surrounded the church and vandalized parked cars. Their efforts were unpopular with the white Southerners who supported continued segregation, and they faced violent attacks in several places along their journey. The day before the Montgomery church service, the riders had arrived in Montgomery and faced a brutal attack at the hands of hundreds of white people armed with bats, hammers, and pipes. The May 21st service was planned by the local Black community to express support and solidarity. As the surrounding mob grew larger and more violent, Dr. King called United States Attorney General Robert S. Kennedy from the church's basement and requested help. Kennedy sent United States Marshals to dispel the riot. The growing mob pelted them with bricks and bottles, and the Marshals responded with tear gas. When police arrived to assist the Marshals, the mob broke into smaller groups and overturned cars, attacked Black homes with bullets and firebombs, and assaulted Black people in the streets. Alabama Governor John Patterson declared martial law in Montgomery and ordered National Guard troops to restore order. That's when authorities arrested 17 white rioters, and by midnight, the streets were calm enough for those in the church to leave. 3 days later, troops escorted the Freedom Riders as they departed to Jackson, Mississippi, where they would face further resistance. In summation, it was through good trouble, collaboration, and consistency that brought about the results of the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides revealed through their demonstrations that some southern states were ignoring the U.S. Supreme Court's mandate to desegregate bus terminals. Months after the Freedom Rides, a petition from U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy spurred the Interstate Commerce Commission, also known as the ICC, to issue tough new regulations backed by fines up to $500 that would eventually end segregated bus facilities. Even after the order went into effect on November 1st of '61, hardcore segregation persisted. Still, the white and colored sign in those bus stations across the South began to come down. In the New York Times, which had earlier criticized the Freedom Riders' enticement and provocation, acknowledged that they indeed started the chain of events which resulted in the new ICC order. And before I close, I would like to leave you all with a quote from the late and great Representative John Lewis: "Never be afraid to make some noise and get into good trouble, necessary trouble."
Thank you, Professor Muse. Our next speaker is Dr. Meredith May. Dr. May is originally from Huntington, Texas, and received her BA from Stephen F. Austin University. She earned her MA and PhD at Texas Christian University, and she is an adjunct instructor for TCC. In 2017, she joined the faculty at Kilgore College, where she continued her research interest in East Texas and post-1945 U.S. history. She is also a former research assistant for the Civil Rights and Black and Brown Oral History Project, a current board member for the Gregg County Historical Museum, on the editorial board for the East Texas Historical Journal, and on the steering committee for Longview's 1919 Remembrance Project. Thank you, Dr. Meredith May, for joining us today.
Hi, let's see. Okay, I think I have control. So thank you everybody for coming out this afternoon. So today I'm going to be looking at police brutality and student protest in Nacogdoches, Texas. So I thought I had control. Maybe not. There we go. Whoop. So the Texas NAACP at mid-century described East Texas as the meanest part of the state. Racism was deeply entrenched in the towns and cities of deep East Texas. Nacogdoches, the self-referred to oldest town in Texas, remained and remains into the 21st century, geographically segregated along racial lines. After the Civil War, African Americans in Nacogdoches created a thriving community along Church Street toward the back of the white commercial district in downtown. So this map that should be coming up in just a second shows that. By the 1920s, the street boasted barbershops, cafes, a hotel, and 2 movie theaters. So it was a fairly substantial business district. It was also prime real estate for white residents who wanted to expand their own areas. The local newspaper, the Daily Sentinel, began calling for the removal of African American residents in northern Nacogdoches to an area in a southeastern part of the city. The Sentinel argued that this would keep the white and colored children from having to crisscross each other's trails as they go and return to school. I'm not quite sure why the slide is not going forward. There we go. So the straight line is Church Street. So this was where the African American side of town was at that time. Nacogdoches whites forcibly removed African American residents and businesses from Church Street to the Orton Hill neighborhood, which you can see circled in black at the corner of the screen. This was forcibly done in 1929. However, there's not a lot of details that tell us how it was done, what processes were used. So, in Orton Hill, African Americans rebuilt their extensive business neighborhood. One of the most prominent of these businesses was Arthur Weaver's General Store. Weaver used the relative independence of owning his own store to lead Nacogdoches' NAACP and argue for the rights of African Americans, particularly within the criminal justice system. Throughout East Texas, local and county level law enforcement officials were part of the system that maintained segregation and created an oppressive environment for African American citizens. Notorious figures became well known for their propensity for violence and inconsistent enforcement of rules and laws to maintain the traditional system. Police brutality, as in the rest of the nation, was one of the many aspects of the white power structure that African Americans demanded be changed. Nowhere in Deep East Texas, though, had the same extensive reputation for police brutality as Nacogdoches. The police department in Nacogdoches kept African Americans strictly in what they viewed as their place. At midnight, all African Americans had to have their lights out inside of their homes into the 1960s. For the African American community in Nacogdoches, as one resident remembered when we interviewed her for the Civil Rights and Black and Brown Oral History Project, she said, strange things happened. Most of those strange things happened at the hands of local law enforcement, particularly people like Constable Travis Helpenstill and Chief of Police Marion Charles, or just MC, Roebuck, who served on the force from the 1940s into the 1970s. And let's see if we can move the slide, maybe. Okay, so Helpenstill was responsible for one of the most famous incidents between law enforcement and the African American community, one that lingered in the collective memory of those who lived in Nacogdoches. Helpenstill was a World War II hero who had served with distinction on Saipan and Iwo Jima. He'd been elected as the youngest constable in Texas in 1946, and therefore his career was being watched. Shortly after his assumption of office, he had the first of a series of run-ins with African Americans within Nacogdoches. So this particular run-in was with an African American preacher named Willie Lee Murchison. He ran from Helpenstill after the constable accosted him. Helpenstill caught up to Murchison and beat him so severely that he required a steel plate in his head. Someone, probably Arthur Weaver, because he was the head of the local NAACP, contacted the national level NAACP about the attack, and Murchison filed a civil suit against Helpenstill. Murchison continued his lawsuit even after receiving threats and intimidation, but it wasn't successful. This probably emboldened Helpenstill as he continued his assaults on African American citizens, attacking an African American World War II veteran in 1948. Helpenstill and other law enforcement officers reportedly fixated on Turner White ever since he had returned from the war. Helpenstill, Roebuck, and other law officers took White from his home late at night, beat him, and then arrested him for public intoxication. The following morning, Helpenstill released White and demanded he leave town, which he and his wife and children did almost immediately. 4 days later, Helpenstill stopped Ellis Hudson Jr. and his cousin, who were transporting a hog to market. During the questioning, Hudson did not address Helpenstill as Sir. Helpenstill then reportedly attacked Hudson, and Hudson then hit him back. Helpenstill and some of his officers then forced Hudson into the car and beat him the entire way back to the county jail. He was then assaulted more at the jail by both Helpenstill and Roebuck, who threatened to kill him. Helpenstill even tried to get Hudson to promise to plead guilty on assault charges and to touch Helpenstill's gun so that it would bear Hudson's prints. Hudson contested the charges, and whenever his father, Ellis Hudson Sr., arrived at the courthouse the following morning to post bail, he had done so after conferring with a white lawyer. Helpenstill arrived shortly afterward, upset at the news that Ellis Jr. was not going to plead guilty. So he'd been trying to frame this guy for a crime he didn't really commit. And the guy wasn't going along with it. So Helpenstiel calls the white lawyer and threatened to kill him for advising the Ellis family. Immediately following that conversation, Helpenstiel ordered Hudson Sr., so that's Hudson Jr.'s father, to follow him into a hallway. Moments later, Helpenstiel yelled, "You tried to pull a knife on me," and fired his gun into Hudson Sr. 3 times, killing him. A pocket knife was found by Hudson Sr.'s body after the shooting, but both the Hudson family and the white lawyer, who had seen the Hudson Sr. that morning, swore the knife was not his or on him at the time of the confrontation. So the son, who had been originally arrested, was released, and he and Arthur Weaver, the head of the NAACP, contacted the national level of the NAACP almost immediately, and they sent 2 investigators to Nacogdoches. So authorities did move forward with prosecuting Helpenstiel for murder. A grand jury indicted him in 1948, and he resigned his position as constable. And this is a really, really important moment in Texas history. This is the first time a first-degree murder indictment had ever gone through against a law enforcement official for killing an African American in the state. So this is a first time ever. Now, once the trial took place, though, after deliberating less than 2 hours, the jury found Helpenstiel not guilty. However, the NAACP did see this as a win, as a step forward, because at least they got the indictment, and that had never happened before. For the African Americans of Nacogdoches, though, this was yet another example of law enforcement officials literally getting away with murder. Moreover, although Helpenstiel no longer had a position of power within law enforcement, Roebuck became chief of police in 1962. And many of the other officials and deputies who had been a part of this still kept their jobs. So Roebuck winds up being just as bad as Helpenstiel. He had a reputation that lingers to this day. One person we interviewed in 2016 said, quote, "Everybody was afraid of Mr. Roebuck." So into the 1950s, if African American men were found to be wearing these large baggy suits, you've probably heard them referred to as zoot suits. If they were caught wearing those suits out on the town, Roebuck would actually stop them and then slice up their suits with scissors and knives. And again, this isn't something that was happening like in the 20s. This was in the 50s. So as the 60s progressed, he's starting to get really worried about the potential for Black militancy in Nacogdoches. So as the civil rights movement is expanding, he's concerned it's going to come there. In particular, he's worried about the university. So Stephen F. Austin University had integrated during the mid-1960s and had a growing population of African American students from other cities and a more liberal faculty and student body than the population of the rest of the town. African American students began organizing on campus. So there's a couple of important organizations here. Let's see if we can get to them. Okay, whoa. Okay, so they formed a chapter of the National Black Students Association, and following the 1968 assassination of MLK, an organization called the King's Men. This was to address the problems that they were seeing on campus, as well as continued segregation downtown. The King's Men kind of started to fall away over time, although they did have a successful protest march on December 7th, 1968, against a washateria that had maintained segregation even 4 years after the Civil Rights Act. So the King's Men forms, and then they go back to being a part of the National Black Student Association. Even though they had their organization, the NBSA felt like second-class citizens. They lacked a designated place to speak, to have their meetings. Students met with the architect of the integration, the president at the time, and he didn't really change anything. He kind of said, you know, I'm going to listen to you, but we still see discriminatory practices against African Americans. And so members of the NBSA reached out to the national level organizer, Mickey McGuire, to help them. So McGuire came to Nacogdoches and speaks to the NBSA as well as sympathetic white professors. And so they staged a march in 1970, which you can see here in this photograph, demanding better treatment of African American students. So the march went off without any issues. And so they keep having marches. And this really upset the chief of police. He had a white informant at SFA who was keeping tabs on McGuire and keeping tabs on the NBSA. He's upset about these boycotts that are happening downtown, and these marches keep happening, and he wants to try to put a stop to them. So the thing that sparks a series of protests and demonstrations that really explode in 70 is the arrest of a woman named QB Dorsey, who's an African-American student at SFA, arrested for allegedly writing hot checks. So Roebuck wouldn't allow anybody, lawyers, representatives from the NBSA, anybody. He wouldn't allow anybody to come visit her. And so they had 15 small demonstrations to express their dissatisfaction with Dorsey's treatment. And while police didn't interfere with the demonstrations, under Roebuck's orders, they took pictures of the protesters, which many felt was intimidation. Then Kent State happened. And after the Kent State shootings in 70, like many other places across the nation, Roebuck's scared there's going to be protests in Nacogdoches at SFA. There was a candlelight march planned, so a peaceful candlelight march on May 13th of 70. So 250 protesters, mostly from SFA, lined up to march from Orton Hill to downtown for what was meant to be both a reaction to Kent State and a march for Black and White Brotherhood. Roebuck at this point orders the demonstration to stop, and several of the protesters were arrested and attacked with mace. Those who weren't returned back to Orton Hill. They organized at one of the protesters' houses, and when her mother left for work the next day, they were planning a follow-up march. But the mother returned home almost immediately and told them, "You guys cannot march because there were people down there on top of the buildings with rifles, shotguns, and all kinds of guns. They're waiting for you." And so the march was abandoned under the threat of violence. So that was kind of the last of the big protests. Roebuck gets sued by the NBSA and their national organizers, and he actually loses in federal court. So he stays in his position until his retirement, while Nacogdoches continued its integration journey, which is still very much on today. However, one of the students at SFA felt that Roebuck did receive, in a way, punishment for his mistreatment of the African American community. Her mother was a nurse at Memorial Hospital and recounted to her daughter, Roebuck had a son, and he was about 16 years old, seriously ill in the hospital. He ended up dying there. And his wife lambasted him because she said, "It's all your fault. All these Black people you have hurt and beat up and done other things to is manifested in our son, and that's why he's dead." So, although there were no more marches or major demonstrations against the oppression within Nacogdoches, the successful lawsuit against Roebuck and the resistance of African Americans showed much less toleration for the harassment of the past, showing exactly what can happen whenever students get together and organize these kinds of things. So I will turn controls back over.
Thank you, Dr. May, and we will now move on to our final presenter today, Joan Johnson. Professor Johnson is the Chair of Government and Paralegal Studies on the Northeast Campus. She's been at TCC for 15 years. She received an MLS and MA in Government from Texas Women's University. She's also a leader for Art College in Civic Education and Engagement, and was recently on a district team that was nominated for and is now a finalist for a 2020 Civvy Award, which is a prestigious national award for civic engagement. So thank you, Professor Johnson, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate what the other two presenters brought to us, and it really adds to what I'm going to discuss. So we're going to look at the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it would behoove all of us just to sit here and look at these words for a moment. It should be jarring to all of us that this statement has to be made and that this organization has to be formed. Throughout the history of our country, Black lives have always been in jeopardy. And going back before we were a country, 400 years. Systemic racism is found in every facet of our country, including education, healthcare. Just this morning, I was watching the news, and in the first round of vaccinations, 60% of those who have been vaccinated are white, and only 5.4% of African Americans have been vaccinated. Housing, student loans, home loans, it goes on and on and on. While all of these areas are truly significant when it comes to systemic racism, the area that is most significant is in the criminal justice system, because people's very lives are at stake, and so is their freedom. In addition to the distressing fact that this statement has to be made and this organization had to be formed, the reaction to the words Black Lives Matter are distressing as well. In response to this statement, we've heard all lives matter, blue lives matter, and there were signs being held at the insurrection at the Capitol saying white lives matter. First of all, white lives have never been in as much jeopardy as black lives. It's not even close. All lives matters can't be a true statement until black lives matter. And finally, blue lives is not even a thing. People are not born blue, and they're not born as police officers. So that's a false analogy. And furthermore, it has been codified in our criminal justice system that blue lives do matter, because if you assault a police officer or even a K-9 unit, there are enhanced penalties. If you murder a police officer, that is one of the small list of offenses in our state and many others that would qualify as a capital felony case. So I just think we need to think about that. We're going to move on and look at the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. And sadly enough, today just so happens to be Trayvon Martin's birthday. Had he not been murdered, he would be 26 years old today. So BLM really begins in 2012 when the man who killed Trayvon Martin was acquitted. And it started with a hashtag Black Lives Matter. Trayvon Martin had Skittles and an iced tea, and he was just walking in his neighborhood to his father's house when he was killed. And I remember when I saw the story, I've got 3 sons, and I just looked at Trayvon Martin and I could see my children, and I was just absolutely horrified. After the hashtag, the 3 women that came up with this really form an organization. And so here are the founders of BLM, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Okay, and we're going to come back and revisit that at the very end. Now, between 2012 and 2014, BLM becomes nationwide. It's gained more traction, and that was in response, unfortunately, to more killings of African Americans, specifically the police killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York. None of the police involved were indicted, and none stood trial. Their mission statement is as follows. They work to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state, but also by vigilantes, people who are not police. During this time, after the killing of George Floyd, BLM is now international. And after the horrifying killing of George Floyd, we see the scope of BLM become larger because white Americans finally start to understand what is really happening. Black Americans had already understood more than anybody else, but that is when we see that. Now, George Floyd was killed in May of 2020, and it did bring worldwide attention and increased national attention to Black Lives Matter and its mission. 4 police officers were involved in the killing of Floyd. That harrowing and horrifying 8 minutes and 46 seconds is how long it took to kill Floyd, and it was on video. And it was seen everywhere. Now, in response to this, we saw BLM protests spring up across our country, but also around the world. In July of 2020, the New York Times stated that BLM might be the largest movement in U.S. history. From May 26th to July 4th, approximately 4,700 protests occurred across the country, which is an average of 140 per day. During the 1960s in the civil rights movement, those protests were comprised of hundreds of thousands of people. But when we look at the BLM protests, we're talking about millions, okay? And not just here, but around the world. Now, regarding the killing of George Floyd, the officer who dug his knee into George Floyd until he died is facing a second-degree murder charge. And it has come out, this is not the first time that he has done this to people he has arrested. The other 3 who were involved, 2 who also knelt on George Floyd, and 1 who did nothing to intervene or to stop the killing, have been charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. All 4 are going to be tried at the same time, which starts next month on March 6th. Right now, we're going to take a minute and we're going to look at some photos. Just like my previous presenters mentioned, pictures are worth 1,000 words. And it was truly on full display the difference between the approach to white protesters as compared to black protesters when we saw the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. So on the right, you see a woman. She's in Louisiana. This is where this took place. Calm, serene, obviously nonviolent, and she's about to get arrested. And she stays calm the whole time with all those police coming at her. On the left, you see someone who broke into the Capitol, who's getting to take a selfie with one of the DC police officers. In this picture, we see this man on the right is in Rochester, upstate New York, and he was turning out for a Black Lives Matter protest, an elderly man. He was shoved down by police, and you can see the blood on the sidewalk. And not only did they shove him down, they continued to just walk past his body. It wasn't until a National Guard member showed up that they got some help for him. He was in the hospital for 2 months, fractured his skull. Whereas on the left, we see there's a person who entered the Capitol illegally and is being escorted by hand down the steps of the Capitol to leave. This picture shows the show of force on the right that came out when Black Lives Matter protests were occurring in DC. You had National Guard, you had this group that showed up that had no insignia whatsoever. It took a while for us to ascertain that these in fact were riot police who worked in the Federal Bureau of Prisons that then Attorney General Barr called up to help, a big, huge presence. And on the left, you see this man who has since been arrested, screaming at a cop in the Capitol, literally screaming at him. Just a huge difference in response. If we look at this, we see that people were able to scale the walls. I remember watching it just being in shock that it was so easily done. And on the left, did you see that helicopter? It is below that building. It went way low, and that's during the BLM protests. You're not supposed to fly that low. And it was, that is an intimidating tactic to have a helicopter fly that low over your head. And then there's this photo. So we all know about the gassing of peaceful protesters in DC so that Trump could get a photo opportunity in front of a church holding up a Bible that he held upside down. On the right, we see this man. That is first of all, I mean, he's just filled with glee and happily getting his photo made. And what he's holding is the podium that belongs to the Speaker of the House. He too has now been arrested, but just the fact that it just seems like no big deal to him to be doing what he's doing just shows you how Black lives are much more in jeopardy than white lives. The white lives that went into the Capitol, when you look at that insurrection, it is a sea of white faces, and they are not afraid. They are not afraid at all. This photo is truly distressing. On the right, that is a police officer face down who was attacked. They tasered him with his own taser. The guy in the red box literally beat this man with an American flag. We know that flags were a big part of the MAGA movement, continue to be. And what we've noticed, if you even look at Charlottesville and other events, you'll see flags, but they're put on, you know, the poles are there for a purpose. You know, it could be a piece of wood, it could be whatever, but you can weaponize that. To juxtapose that, in Maricopa County, Arizona, there was a group of 10 Black Lives Matter protesters that knocked down some orange cones, you know, like you have on the highway, and they've been charged with multiple felonies. They're facing like 30, 40 years. And one of the reasons that they're doing that to them is because they had umbrellas. And even though they didn't use the umbrellas as weapons, they said they were potential weapons. But also, all of the group that they're charging with these felonies, they had on shirts that said ACAB, and I think we all know what that stands for, and if you don't, you can look it up. But they said that they were a criminal street gang, and they compared them to the Bloods and the Crips. So just the response to protesters, depending on your color and what issue it is you're supporting, is just a dramatic display of the disparity we see in this country. All of this has culminated in a 2021 Nobel Peace Prize nomination. Peter Eid, I don't know how to say his name. He's a member of the Norwegian parliament because Norway hands this stuff out. Here's what he said. I find that one of the key challenges we have seen in America, but also in Europe and Asia, is the kind of increasing conflict based on inequality. Black Lives Matter has become a very important worldwide movement to fight racial injustice. They have had a tremendous achievement in raising global awareness and consciousness about racial injustice. And the photo that is in the background, y'all, that is in Germany. That's not even in America, okay? So I said we would kind of end the way we began, and there's a reason for this. There are so many significant things we need to learn and know about racial disparity in America, and these presentations are very helpful to that end. But I want to remind everybody listening, these three women started this organization on Twitter, and then they created it, and now it's worldwide, and they're up for a Nobel Peace Prize. Far too often we hear people say, I'm just one person, you know, it's just one vote. But I want us all to be aware that we really do have a lot of power, and there are so many truly significant things going on in the world right now and in our country that really calls us to action. And so I want you to take that to heart. You do have power, you know, and in addition to these three women in the Nobel Peace Prize, one woman who's been involved in Black Lives Matter in the local chapter, Cori Bush, she's now a member of Congress. So I truly hope that you take away from this many important things, and that you go forward knowing that you can have the power to make change. You just gotta start. And thank you.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. So I want to open this up for questions. So going back to Professor, can you tell us how Black History Month began?
Hi. So Great question. So Black History Month started with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So that particular group sponsored what is called a National Negro History Week back in 1926. And so because of that, you had cities and schools and communities, they began to adopt that method to celebrate the accomplishments within our community. So I want to say it was 1960, thanks to, again, that momentum from the Civil Rights Movement, that Negro History Week evolved into Black History Month. But it wasn't until 1976 when President Ford officially recognized Black History Month, calling upon the public to, quote unquote, seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history.
Thank you. And we had another question. How did the African American press cover the Freedom Riders compared to the mainstream press?
Another great question. So back in that time, the Black community did have our own personal news outlets. So you had journalists like Moses Newson, who worked for the Tri-State Defender and Baltimore Afro-American newspapers. And then you also had a gentleman by the name of Gene Roberts, who was a correspondent for the New York Times. They covered the Freedom Rides by actually placing their own lives in danger by traveling with those Freedom Riders. So knowing that, you know, we didn't have that type of technology, that story being reported was contingent upon them coming back home alive to report that. And so as we saw with the Black Lives Matter protest, with the technology that we have today, if you're out in the thicket and you're protesting and you have your phone and people are going live and they're able to share immediately what is happening now, that wasn't the case back then. So it really was contingent upon them making it home alive by putting themselves in danger, attending these dangerous but needed events.
Thank you. So our next question is for Dr. May. Dr. May, we have a couple of students asking about Roebuck and how we should view him. Is he a traitor? What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't think that Roebuck was unique, because we see police brutality throughout that period in other places. I do think that he's a particularly good example, as somebody else noted in the chat. He's a good example of how we see this racism within the police force at this point in time, and the almost kind of arbitrariness of it, the little things that Roebuck fixated on, like the curfew, the fact that African Americans have a curfew, and he would shoot out your lights if your lights were on after midnight. So we see that, the cutting up of the zoot suits, just because it's a flexing of power, and it's this obsessiveness over little things. It's this effort to chip away at the entire African American community, and not just like people who committed crimes, criminals. So it's a good example of that.
Thank you. We have another question here about Nacogdoches, and this only being 50 to 70 years in the past. So 2 questions here. Do you think that being so close to our own time is why we still have systematic racism among police? And then I want to ask you if you feel like this has fallen out of our memory, our state memory, even though it was just a short while back.
So yes, I do feel like that this is part of this, these battles we still are dealing with. As you know, we just heard about the Black Lives Matter movement, and as we're seeing today in the news, this is stuff that's still with us. And so people like Roebuck, the people who supported him, they didn't just disappear, and their ideas certainly didn't either. They're training the next generation of cops. They're the ones who are going to be saying, this is how we do this. And they're creating this culture that supports this kind of behavior. And there's always going to be people who disagree. For example, I actually work today at Kilgore College with a psychology instructor who was a cop under Roebuck in Nacogdoches. And he quit. He couldn't handle it. He he couldn't be the cop that Roebuck wanted him to be. He couldn't be horrifically racist. So again, it's still, again, I work with a guy who was trained in that way. And so, yes, I do think that stuff is still with us because of that.
And we have one more question for you. We have a student who wants to know more about the Black and Brown project that I mentioned in your bio.
Okay. So the Civil Rights in Black and Brown Oral History Project was something that was done the summer of 2015 and the summer of 2016. So it's this giant oral history project using graduate students from across the nation. And we went out in teams to do interviews with people who participated in, lived through the civil rights movement. And this was both the African American civil rights movement as well as the Chicano movement. We then took those interviews, and they are up on a website, and they're available to view. And so a lot of where I got my information from that I was discussing was from those interviews that I did and my partner did when we were in Nacogdoches. That's where we were stationed, one of the locations. So I can put that website over in over somewhere if anybody wants to check it out.
Thank you. I am now going to ask a couple questions to Professor Johnson. So Professor Johnson, one question that we just had is that maybe this should be called Equality Month, so that includes race and gender, all races and all genders. What do you think about that versus Black History Month? And I think you might be muted. So I'm going to go back to Dr. May so we can get Professor Johnson's audio fixed. Dr. May, another one of our professors here, Karen Wisely, wanted to know about the people you interviewed and just how those interviews went, what you discussed, what you learned from them.
Well, Karen was one of my coworkers. She was on a different team. She was stationed somewhere else. But the interviews were fascinating because, first of all, we were interviewing people who felt overwhelmingly like they didn't do anything. And it was because they were comparing themselves to marchers and protesters like Stacy was talking about, actually. They're comparing themselves to the Freedom Riders. And they're like, yeah, we just walked around downtown. We didn't do anything. We didn't get our heads bashed in. We weren't on that national scale. And I think that was kind of the best thing that I got out of it, or in terms of what I wanted to really impart to other people. The fact that you don't have to be on that big national stage to make change happen. These are all normal people who felt like they weren't important. And that definitely was the best thing we got out of the interviews that we did in both Nacogdoches, and we were also in Lufkin. So Lufkin, Nacogdoches, that's really what we got there.
Thank you, and we think Professor Johnson is working now, so I'm going to pass this over to her.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think that this question is along the lines to the reactions we've seen to just the statement Black Lives Matter. If we look at history, really everything, it's really dominated by what white people, white males predominantly, have done throughout our history, and largely ignoring the efforts of women and people of color in the founding of this country and what's ongoing now. So I think that if we look at our culture, there's celebration of white people everywhere, and I think it's significant that we focus on marginalized groups for a month and finally shine light on what really happened in history, and who, there was a guy during the Civil War who had been enslaved, and he overtook a ship and killed all the Confederate soldiers, and then he takes it to load people who had been enslaved and puts them on the ship and gets them to freedom. I mean, how has that not been made into a movie yet? You know, there's just so many things that we don't know about African American history because it just hasn't been told. So that's what I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to scan here and make sure that I didn't miss any questions because we have just a couple of minutes left. And I think we've hit all the questions. Oh, sorry, one more. Professor Johnson, can you tell us why there's a lot of opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement from within evangelical communities, specifically white evangelical communities?
Well, I think that when we look at white evangelicals, we need to go back. And I wrote my thesis about this, actually. If we look at the formation of the Christian Coalition, it was after Pat Robertson ran for president. And what he was able to do while running for president was compile a list of mailing addresses of people who supported him. And that, in turn, turns into this Christian Coalition. And many focused on the fact that they were formed and focused solely on the issue of abortion, which, of course, that was one of their issues. But really underlying it was this idea of keeping segregation in place. At Liberty University, they didn't start allowing an evangelical university, private school. They didn't start allowing Black people to attend there until the 1980s. So I think, you know, we just all really need to do some self-exploration and think about why in the world is there such resistance to a statement such as this one? And then that resistance comes from all walks of life. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that was all of our questions. I want to thank all of our presenters for being here with us today, for giving us a lot to think about, and for helping us get African American History Month kicked off. For students that are here for credit, I am putting a link into the chat. You should be able to see it. Go click on that. That's how you will get credit for attending. I do want to let you know that we have 2 more of these protest sessions left in our series. We're going to have one on Women's History Month, and then we're going to have one on LGBTQ history in April. Dr. Northrup, do you want to also plug your event that's coming up next week?
Sure. We are having a talk for the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and Phil Armstrong, who is in charge, he's the project director of the Centennial Commission for that event, will be speaking for us on Teams Live, just like this session here today, 1 week from today on February 12th at 12:30. So if you would like to join us, I will post the link here in the chat as well, the Q&A as well. And we would love to have you come and attend that in addition to our event today. And thank you all so much for joining us. We truly it's so exciting to see so many students here in the audience and to see your questions. And I really love that there was questions at the end saying, like, what can we do to help? And I think Professor Johnson talked about that a little bit. And so many of the other speakers kind of brought out, a lot of times there's these amazing stories from the small people who were doing small things that ended up getting just so sometimes in like worldwide movements, but sometimes within their own communities as well. And I think that this shows us that we're never too small to be able to make a difference and make an impact. And whether that's through your social media, whether that's through your activism in your communities, we all are able, I think, to make a difference. And I challenge us all to find those ways, just like the individuals we saw today who sometimes had to be creative. Thank you all so much for being here. We hope to see you next week at 12:30. If you have any questions, please email us, and we hope to see you at our upcoming webinars as well. Have a great afternoon. Stay healthy and safe.